Hey guys, this unit or this chapter, as you know, is all about federalism, this relationship between or the relationship and sharing of powers between the national government and the state governments. Section 1 was all about powers, all the different types of powers, delegated, reserved, concurrent, denied, all those. We looked at examples of everything. And I mentioned how federalism is a really important concept. My advanced government classes, we have an entire unit over federalism. It really is that important. It's that system of government that we have here in the United States and this power sharing agreement that the delegates at the Constitutional Convention came up with. What we're going to look at in this section is how federalism has changed, how the powers of the national government and states have changed over time. So it's kind of like a history lesson intermixed with government. The Supreme Court played a big role in the change or the advancement of federalism. We know the Constitution gives the Supreme Court the final say in resolving disputes. Article 3 specifically is about the judicial branch, Article 3 of the Constitution. It's specifically about the judicial branch, and it specifically gives them the authority to hear cases involving constitutional issues, U.S. laws, and disputes between the states. We know the Supreme Court, they're impartial. They act as a referee or as an umpire calling balls and strikes between the nation, between the federal government and the states. Over time, in tomorrow's lessons, we're going to be looking at a couple Supreme Court cases. Over time, the courts have gradually increased the power of the national government. And even still today, the idea of federalism continually changes to meet the needs of our generation. So let's jump right in to this first idea. And this first idea is called dual federalism. And dual federalism was the earliest, form of federalism. This is where the national government right here and the state governments were each in their own spheres. The national government had responsibilities, the state government had responsibilities, and they stayed within their own bubble. And we call this dual federalism. They were on equal ground. One of the first early important Supreme Court cases was a case called McCulloch versus Maryland. This is where the national government had a national bank. Maryland didn't like a national bank. They had state banks, and they had rules that state banks had to follow. Well, the national bank came in, they didn't like that. And the state of Maryland tried to put a tax on the national government, or on this national bank. The national bank in Maryland was led by a guy by the name of McCulloch, James McCulloch. And he said, you want me to pay this tax because I'm a national bank? I'm not doing that. You can't tax the federal government. So they sued, and it reached all the way to the Supreme Court. And this case is called McCulloch versus Maryland. And the Supreme Court said, you know what? The federal government does have the power to create a national bank, even though it's not in the Constitution. And think about it. Nowhere in the Constitution does it say the federal government can make a national bank. But the Supreme Court, led by John Marshall, said that the national bank was justified under the necessary and proper clause. This is an implied power. The Supreme Court said that this bank is going to help the national government carry out its expressed or delegated powers. The power to regulate interstate commerce, the power to regulate currency. And even though national bank isn't in there, it's implied that you need a bank to regulate interstate commerce and to regulate currency. It just makes sense. And so this gave the federal government a little bit more power. The Supreme Court said, you know what? Congress can do things that's not specifically mentioned in the Constitution. They gave rise to that Article 1, Section 8, Number 17, the Necessary and Proper Clause. That's going to allow the federal government to expand its powers. We're going to look at this case, McCulloch versus Maryland, a little closer tomorrow, but that's just the recap. Over time, we know we're going to have the Civil War in the mid-1800s, 1861, or it's going to start in 1861. And it just didn't start in 1861. There's a buildup, and the United States became divided over this issue of slavery. There were issues that got tied in, like states' rights. Does the national government have the power to regulate what goes on within a state? And there's some theories that were developed over time saying states could nullify national laws. And this is the doctrine of nullification. Nullification, the root word is nullify, which means to cancel out. And some Southern politicians said that states had the power to do that, that if a national law conflicted with state regulations, state interests, then the states could nullify that federal law. Now, we know Article 6 of the Constitution has the supremacy clause that says anytime the national government and state governments conflict, the national government wins. And so this theory of nullification was pushed as an excuse. And then building up closer to the Civil War is the idea of secession, that states believed they had the right to leave the Union. And so states and the national government are fighting each other. They're fighting each other over slavery. And there's other things that are being brought in with slavery. Like I said, states' rights, nullification, secession, all those, but it's all about slavery. And who has the power to do this? Who has the final power? And this is federalism, guys. This is federalism. It's the sharing of power. It's the fight over whose responsibility is this? Is it the national governments or is it the state governments? We know the Union won, the South or Confederacy lost. And so the Civil War ended the idea of nullification. It ended the idea of secession, that we know as a result of the Civil War, the national government is supreme. And so the national government is going to expand its authority. We have the 13th, the 14th, the 15th Amendments that were passed. Those abolished slavery, it defined citizenship, it prohibited states from denying citizens' rights, it gave black men the right to vote. So the national government is taking on a more national role, and it's getting more involved in the states. So they are expanding their power. In the early 1900s, we have the progressive movement that you learned about in American history. There's lots and lots of change, lots of technology, lots of population growth. We have the old immigrants and new immigrants that you learned about. And those brought about a whole host of problems, social problems and economic problems, overcrowded cities, crime rates, dangerous working conditions, the expansion of huge corporations forming into monopolies. And the states just weren't equipped to handle such a huge issue like monopolies, like the dangerous working conditions in factories all across America. And so the states just couldn't do it. And so it was the national government that stepped in to pass legislation. They passed the Pure Food and Drug Act, the Meat Inspection Act. They had a whole host of workplace safety reforms. And these were all in an effort to reform social and business issues. All of them, just about all of them, used the Interstate Commerce Clause that said Congress has the right to regulate interstate commerce. They said, corporation factories, you make a product here in Pennsylvania, but it gets shipped to Virginia, that's interstate commerce. We can regulate what goes on in your factory. And so the national government is taking on these huge roles. The Sherman Antitrust Act helped fight monopolies. And so the government is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. It's having a bigger and bigger role in all of America. We have the great stock market crash, Great Depression. FDR comes in, starts a whole host of New Deal programs to address the needs of all Americans. At first, with the Great Depression, most people wanted to do it on their own. It was a state issue. But as the country kept going lower and lower and lower and lower, people turned to the national government. And so the national government stepped in. And the national government and state governments started working together. The national government supported the state governments. And so during this time, we call this form of federalism cooperative federalism. Like when you cooperate, you work together. Well, that's what's going on here. Instead of, we have the idea of dual federalism, equal, this is my area, this is your area, and we're staying out of each other's spheres. Well, with cooperative federalism, it's, hey, let's help each other out. We're working together on all sorts of issues. The federal government is kind of slipping over into the state government's areas of responsibility, but they're working together, and that's called cooperative federalism. In the 1960s, when we had the 50s and 60s, especially the 60s, when we had the civil rights movement, Lyndon Johnson, we're going to have a form of federalism that we call creative federalism. And this was as a result of the Great Society, Lyndon Johnson's plans to eliminate poverty, to eliminate this social inequality that's in America. We have Medicare and Medicaid coming about. And what we see now, the form of federalism that we see during this time is called creative federalism. And creative, coming up new ideas, new things. And so what's going to happen is the national government, for instance, with Medicare and Medicaid, the national government is going to give states money in the form of grants to do these programs. And so we have this national goal of, we're say, eliminating poverty. That's a countrywide goal. And so the federal government's going to give money to the states for Medicare and Medicaid. And so the states actually run Medicare and Medicaid, not the federal government, but the federal government gives the states money. And if the federal government says, you know what, the states aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing, then they could withhold that funding. And now the states are in a tough situation. They're like, man, we have all this Medicare and Medicaid payments to make, all these people on Medicare and Medicaid, and now the federal government's threatening to withhold all this money, millions and millions, and actually billions and billions of dollars today. The states are like, man, we got to do what the federal government says. And this money, these funds given to the states became huge sums of money. We're talking billions and billions and billions of dollars. So we have the early dual federalism. Then we have cooperative federalism of the 30s and 40s. Then we have creative federalism of the 60s. Now in the 80s, we have an idea of new federalism. And new federalism was brought about by Ronald Reagan. And he said, you know what? The federal government's, we started off here, two equal footings. But now the federal government's, seems to be going up here and here and here, and they seem to be taking over all sorts of state issues. Reagan said, you know what? I want to bring this back down. I want to return it to the way it was, where the states have their issues and they do what they need to do, and then the federal government has their issues. So this idea of new federalism is returning power back to the states. Reagan thought that the federal government had taken over too many things that the states should be doing. So he said, hey, states, why don't you start doing it again? That the states are closer to the people, that the states know what the people want. Ronald Reagan worked at reducing the size of the government. started cutting things back to try to get the federal government back down a little bit, because right now they're like way up here, and say, let's bring this down. This idea with new federalism is devolution. Think about that. Evolution, evolution, things improve or evolve over time. Well, think about devolution or de-evolution. We're reverting back to the way it was, returning power to the states, reducing the power of the national government, knocking it down some notches so the states are on a more equal footing. That was a lot, but it's all about federalism, how federalism has changed over time. And you can see how, we started off here, and then the federal government started coming up here, and then the federal government started dipping its fingers into state issues. And then the federal government said, hey, we have some national issues, and states, we want you to do these things. And now we have Reagan saying, hey, let's kind of bring this back down. So federalism has changed over time. And that was the purpose of this section. If you have any questions, let me know. And once again, the assignment or the next assignment is going to be about some Supreme Court cases dealing with federalism. McCulloch versus Maryland is one, and there will be another one or two. If you have any questions, just shoot me an email and I'll help you out. Talk to you later.